Yes, I am, Heather. COVID infected, but I'm safe from here.
Thank you very much. We've got a number of questions here, and I encourage everybody to pop your questions into the chat function. We've got a little bit of time now for a question and answer session. So the first one of these, I've got a question here from Kate Duffy about what is the assumed concentration of pigs and cattle in the simulation?
So this was based on aerial surveys and consultation with landholders and biosecurity officers. We had about 1 to 2 pigs per square K across the area, and we had about 7 or 8 cattle per square kilometre, and so there's a lot more cattle there. I think some of our other areas like Cape York might have a lot more pigs and still have cattle, and so it'd be interesting to see this study repeated elsewhere where the densities were different. But you know, 1 or 2 pigs per square K is pretty common across a lot of Australia. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just want to get a comment from you. I know there's been a bit of commentary in the chat box already, but going in and shooting pigs and the impact of that on scattering them and making them harder to control.
Yep. So there's a long history here of this topic being of concern to people. So Glenn Saunders did a eradication sort of simulation out at Macquarie Marshes, and he found that there was very little movement, but 1 or 2 pigs did move. So then New South Wales DPI got in and did a heap of work on this in the 80s and 90s, looking at whether pigs actually do disperse when they're highly persecuted. They got up with their, they tagged pigs with radio tags, collars, and then they shot them from choppers, and they watched what happened. And they didn't disperse, so they're pretty sedentary, both normally and even when they're persecuted. And I mean, there's other studies like that. Peter Cayley up in Douglas Valley area in the Territory tagged a heap of pigs. He captured them in traps, wrestled them to the ground, put ear tags in them, spent weeks and months chasing them around with radio tracking devices, and they still say there's just a few that disperse a long distance. So in the time scale that we're talking about, which is weeks or months for eradication attempt, they're not going to be moving far. The odd one might, but I think that the movement of livestock before it's diagnosed is going to be much more significant.
Thank you very much. A question around, do you think that the results would be similar in a region with higher pig density, such as in central Queensland or even in Cape York, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, that's a good thinking question. It's very density sort of driven, this thing, behaviour and density. So it may be that it'll spread a bit more and pigs will be more important in some of these higher density areas. And it'd be really interesting to see that work done. Maybe Richard Bradhurst, who might be on this call, he's got a great model, AIDED. He's doing some ASF modelling in pigs. He's also got a great experience with foot and mouth disease modelling. So maybe it's a question for Richard to adapt the model and continue on this sort of question in high density pig areas.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. It'll be interesting. Yeah, some of the other ones here are commentary, but there's another question here from Kate again, saying here that the Tauranga Shire is, its size in the forested areas, and 20% of the producers in the area have a bush border, and assuming 1 pig per kilometre of boundary. How does she encourage stakeholders to maintain good biosecurity pillars with public land managers, such as with exclusion fencing? Yeah,
it's a tough ask, isn't it? Because control is very expensive. There's lots of time spent doing it. I guess if you've got sheep, there's a pretty good argument to say you should be controlling pigs across the landscape, because you'll be getting a lot of predation from lamb predation. So there's 30 to 40% of lamb crops are taken by pigs if there's enough pigs around. But if you're a cattle producer, it's going to be a tough ask, and it's more about probably producers cutting the damage that occurs to their farm paddocks when pigs get in and cause a bit of damage. So it's a tough ask. I'm not sure that you should be pushing it for biosecurity necessarily of disease. I think you should be pushing it for agricultural damage and biodiversity conservation.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Good point too. Just in terms of another question here is from Megan Plant in relation to dispersal, and would that be related to the size of landscape for these studies? Because you can see the dispersal from shooting has a great negative impact in smaller scale land holdings such as the properties in the Pilharvey region in WA?
Yep, it might have it. That's a good point, and perhaps it would. Some of these pigs that are in resource-rich areas with small home ranges may have a higher density and more overlapping home ranges, and you can get them easily moving sideways a kilometre during a control program. But for me, as an epidemiologist, that's not a huge thing if they move a kilometre, because you're going to have 10, 20 kilometre buffers around this for your livestock control anyway. So, yep, it's definitely something that could happen. And I won't say that our study answers everything, because there's different environments and different densities and different home range sizes around the country. But just there's been 3 or 4 different studies that have looked at this in different habitats, and they're getting pretty consistent results.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions that anyone has for Brendan while he's with us? I have nothing. Here's one. Brendan, do you have any resources you can share about how you work all this stuff out?
It's pretty hard. Like for a start, the Visual Basics and old technology now. And Richard would probably be laughing down his sleeve at me for having used that old technology, but it was good at the time. So there's not many coders doing this sort of tool anymore. Richard will have to step up to the plate with the more modern approaches. I guess it's also very complex to model this. Like, this is 4 years work for me. I have 1,000 lines of code and a couple of years in the field. So it's really hard to have one of these tools made available for people to use. There's so many assumptions and parameters. I think we're better identifying 2 or 3, use cases for it, and then exploring options and publishing results so everyone can read the options. I think there might be moves afoot to make a more accessible ADIS model, perhaps. I won't make any promises, because it's not my responsibility or my model, but there may be a real-time, simpler ADIS model coming in the next few years. And if that's the case, then that may be something that can be used by state jurisdictions to model this in a bit more, with a bit more simplicity.
Yep, no worries. I'm just looking through this to the chat function, just stating here and just picking up a point, a reminder there from Peter West around from Andrew Bankson, just saying that we've exposed GPS collared pigs to aerial shooting several times and it hasn't caused them to disperse yet, which is interesting.
Yeah, so those consistent findings across the country in different habitats and landscapes, isn't there?
There's another one here from Darren Higgins. Is it your belief that if cattle were excluded from the landscape, FMD could not persist solely in the feral pig population?
It depends on density and depends on the behaviour of pigs, but in this habitat that we modelled, pigs were not numerous enough. The abundance and density was too low for them to maintain infection. So as a general thing, we found that 20% of all the introductions died out in 30 days across, even if cattle were involved. So it doesn't always establish full stop even if cattle are there. So 20% died out. And then when we introduced it to just pigs, then they'd always die out eventually. There just weren't enough pigs there to maintain it, and they're so sedentary. If pigs get infected by foot and mouth disease, their hooves are sloughing off perhaps, and they're hot, they're lying under trees, they can't walk, so they don't walk over to the next pig mob necessarily. So that's what we're seeing. So it's only when you get involved with cattle populations that you start getting that widespread dispersion and transmission.
Thank you, Brendan. And another question here from Ron Glanville. Is a model essentially showing FMD infects all pigs in an area and it then dies out given no carrier state? Yep,
that was one of the points, Ron. Nice to hear from you, Ron. There's no carrier state for FMD in pigs, whereas cattle, you can get that sort of 2 to 3 months carrier state. It's pretty rare, but you can get that. That's what complicates, cattle compared with pigs. There's no carrier state. They're all over it or dead within a week or 2. So that's one of the factors about pigs. It's different with CSF. Like I said, like when we did that modelling of CSF, it did spread. We had slightly higher distributions or density, in our CSF paper. So that might have had an impact, but it was mostly the fact that CSF can have a carrier state, and so you can get healthy pigs walking around for months with CSF. So that was what was driving, we think, transmission in the CSF modelling that we did.
Thank you, Brendan. If there's no other late questions, you've got a minute. So if anyone wants to madly type, feel free. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you, Brendan, for your time in putting your presentation together and your time today for the questions session in this as well. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks. I might go and lie down under a tree now.
Thank you.
See ya.